Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Iacono. On this week's program, we tackle President Joe Biden's immigration agenda, what he's already done and what he might yet do, and whether Congress will go along with him. More of that to come. Stick around. Since the campaign trail, Biden has promised to reverse many of Donald Trump's hardline immigration policies. On his first day in office, he delivered on several of these promises with a slew of executive orders, from reinstating the DACA program to ending the Muslim ban. The administration has also released a second set of orders just this past week. In addition, the White House has proposed the single largest immigration bill since the era of the Gang of Eight in 2013. If passed, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 would establish an earned pathway to citizenship for almost all of undocumented immigrants, prioritize smart border controls, and address the root causes of migration from Central America. Some in the advocacy community are saying even this isn't enough, and the administration is dragging its feet on repealing some of the harshest border policies, while Republicans are claiming that Biden's pushing too far and abandoning enforcement. To help us unpack all of this action on immigration is This Week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at BPC. She is joined by Laura Hall, Managing Director of BPC Action, and Casey Higgins, a BPC Fellow with the Immigration Project and former policy advisor to Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Ladies, welcome back.
Hi there, Rachel.
Hello. Good to have you all. So, Theresa, I'm going to start with you. Biden promised to reverse many of Trump's policies during his first 100 days in office. Since January 20th, there have been approximately 10 or 11 executive orders on immigration. Can you give us a breakdown of the current state of play of the recent executive orders, as well as the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 that Biden has introduced?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, there's been a flurry of immigration activity at the beginning of the Biden administration. I would say that it is equal to and maybe even surpasses the flurry of immigration activity we saw at the beginning of the Trump administration. Of course, it's going in different directions from what Trump did, and much of what Biden has done so far is to try to move away from both Trump policies and practices in operation. So on day one, he signed a slew of executive orders, at least 5 of which cover immigration, which is quite a number of them. And I'll go through them pretty quickly. One of the executive orders terminated the emergency declaration that Trump made to take money from the Defense Department and other sources to build his border wall. So he ended the quote unquote emergency declaration and ordered the agencies to stop, to the extent possible, continued construction of the wall and revisit those contracts. He can't just sort of end them, terminate the contracts unilaterally. That does have to go through a process. But by doing this, he says that he wants to basically stop construction as much as possible right now. And then that once the agencies involved, which include DHS and the Army Corps of Engineers, a plan for redirecting funds that had been put forward to the wall and considering terminating or repurposing existing contracts on the wall. A second proclamation ended what he called the discriminatory bans on entry to the United States. This revoked the early presidential proclamations that Trump did in January of 2017, the so-called Muslim ban or travel bans that were the subject of extensive litigation, and that ended up in the Supreme Court, were eventually allowed to go into effect. This ended those bans. It also stated fairly clearly that the policy of the United States is not to issue bans by nationality or by country like that. And it told the State Department to resume processing of cases that were stopped by those bans as much as possible and as quickly as possible, and especially any cases that were under consideration for waivers. The next executive order was a revision of what he called civil immigration enforcement policies. So one of the early Trump executive orders was on Interior Immigration Enforcement. That is the memorandum that set forth a lot of the policies that were carried out by ICE during the Trump administration and basically undid the prioritization of apprehensions by ICE that the Obama administration had. In fact, this executive order by Biden reinstates many of those. It directed the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, Secretary of Homeland Security, Director of OMB, and everyone else to look at all of the actions and agency guidance that was issued under that previous executive order and create revisions as soon as possible to them. Notably, this executive order did not implement the 100-day deportation moratorium that Biden had suggested, but that was done via a DHS memo shortly after the executive order was signed, although it was later blocked by a court in Texas. Biden also, as he promised, reinstated the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, program. He issued an executive order, essentially a memorandum, to the Homeland Security Secretary and the Attorney General to resume the DACA program as it existed when it was created in 2012, to rescind any and all guidance that changed that program and put it back in place and allow people to apply fully. Another executive order undid President Trump's attempt to determine how many undocumented immigrants were in states and consider that for apportionment in the decennial census. This is a little bit of a moot point, only insofar that the Census Bureau had already said they weren't going to be able to do it and it wasn't going to happen. But this officially rescinded Trump's executive order so that the government will not try to continue to do that. He reinstated deferred forced departure for Liberians, which was due to expire or had expired, so extended ability to stay there. This was a significant number of executive orders. And then, as I mentioned, DHS issued its own internal memorandum implementing the interior enforcement priorities, again, looking very much like the ones that were existing under President Obama. And then, a week later, the president signed a bunch more executive orders. He signed an executive order first on restoring faith in our legal immigration systems and strengthening integration of new Americans that reestablished the Task Force on New Americans that was started under the Obama administration, under the Domestic Policy Council in the White House. It also ordered the agencies to look at any barriers that impede access to immigration benefits and fair, efficient adjudications of those benefits. So a lot of policies that were implemented by USCIS during the Trump era, especially under things like the Buy American, Hire American executive order and other executive orders signed by the president, have created huge backlogs and delays in immigration adjudications. That executive order also directs the agencies to look at all of the regulations that have been published under the Trump administration and determine which might need revision or revocation under the stated new policy that this executive order puts forward. And it's worth quoting this a little bit because it's such a huge change from the policy of the prior administration. The executive order states very clearly that the policy of the United States is that new Americans and their children fuel our economy, working in every industry, including healthcare, construction, caregiving, manufacturing, service, and agriculture. They open and successfully run businesses. They are essential workers. They have helped lead the world in science, technology. They're on the front lines of research. And it says, consistent with our character as a nation of opportunity and of welcome, it's essential to ensure that our laws and policies encourage full participation by immigrants, including refugees, in our civic life, et cetera, et cetera. So this is definitely a redirection of all immigration policy across the federal government in terms of what the policy of the United States government is and will be going forward. It does not make any immediate changes. I should note that. But what it does say is that it starts a process where the agencies will review everything that has been done to consider changes. A second executive order was another campaign promise, and that is establishing an interagency task force on the reunification of families. And that does exactly what it says. It creates a new task force that will be led by the Secretary of Homeland Security and include Secretary of State, Health and Human Services, the Attorney General, and other employees. And their job essentially is to make sure that they can, to the extent possible, identify all children who had been separated from their families from January 2017 till 2020, until 2021, under the zero tolerance policy or any other policy, and reunify them as expeditiously as possible. And it also looks at things like granting parole to them to allow them to come back and meet in the United States. It doesn't necessarily say, as some advocates wanted, that they would provide any U.S. status for these families. The point is just to make sure they get reunited. Another executive order was to deal with the issues at the U.S.-Mexico border by creating a comprehensive regional framework to address the causes of migration, manage migration throughout North and Central America, and provide safe and orderly processing of asylum seekers at the United States border. Again, like many of these other orders, this order directs the agencies involved to craft plans that include certain aspects to address migration in the region. Some of those plans are to include restarting the Central American Minors Program, whereby unaccompanied minors with family in the United States could apply in the country to move to the United States. Allotting more refugee slots for Central America to allow refugees to apply in the area through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program rather than coming to the border. It directs an immediate end to two expedited asylum processing programs at the border called PACER and HARP, which had not been used very much recently since the Title 42 orders, but had processed several thousand people before COVID hit. It also indicates that the government should study how and when it might end the migration protection protocols. So again, another executive order that doesn't do a lot immediately, but does tell the agencies to do things. Importantly, it talks about addressing these issues via addressing root causes in the region and through regional cooperation with the countries in the region to manage the migration flows. So, these are very significant executive orders all together. And I think that, and we heard just as we're recording this, that another executive order is being signed that will increase the refugee cap in the next fiscal year, starting in October, to 125,000. Again, I think that a lot of these executive orders are indicative rather than directive to the government. They are indicating to the agencies the direction they want them to go rather than actually making policy changes on their own. And I think that's for two reasons. One is that laws vest most of the authority to actually take these actions in the heads of the agencies. Like, the agency heads are the ones that issue regulations, not the president. But two, I think also it's creating a new policy process that says that our government, this new government, is going to work in concert with the agencies to put together policies and not direct them from top down necessarily, the way, for example, it was understood that Stephen Miller and groups in the White House would impose policies on agencies. So it's a different policymaking process, definitely a different direction, a reset, if you will, for American immigration policy, and a lot of work for the agencies to do.
Right, and those are just the executive orders. So let's kind of transition to Biden's U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. And Laura, I want to try and bring you into the conversation. I mean, there's truly so much to talk about here. So Biden has indicated that he is considering tackling this massive bill piecemeal. So Theresa and Laura, can you talk about what kind of continuing role you see the White House playing as the bill or bills move forward? And if the bill does move forward piecemeal, what sections of the bill do you see moving forward first?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in here. So Congress has a lot on its plate. I think they're tackling the pandemic, obviously, both all facets of that, from economic recovery to the vaccine distribution and healthcare disparities and all the kind of things that are coming to light because of COVID. They've also got impeachment and other things kind of facing them. Climate change, healthcare, immigration, the list is long. So I think that there's a few dynamics going on here. My bet is that Congress will kind of tackle everything initially through the lens of both economic recovery and COVID relief. So they're debating kind of a big spending bill right now that would be kind of a rescue package for COVID. Are there a few vehicles there that might move? There might be more than one rescue package needed. I think immigration comes into play in those packages if it relates to either economic recovery or COVID relief. So we've got some kind of issues swirling around whether or not immigrant families or mixed status families might get direct payments if there's any kind of aid packages that get over the finish line. What are kind of the rules of the road governing some of the vaccine distribution and other things like that for immigrant healthcare workers? And a lot of the healthcare workforce is immigrants, and how do we kind of tackle that? So there are a lot of related issues kind of in the immigration space that also apply to COVID recovery, and I think that that's going to be Congress's focus right now. In terms of the Biden legislation, I kind of tend to view bills that originate from a White House or a White House itself can't technically introduce a bill. They need to get a congressional member or champion or something like that to introduce a bill. But I do tend to kind of view them as starting points as opposed to ending points. That's kind of a list of the administration's priorities. It's what they would like to get done. It's not necessarily what will get done. I think a big package like that, kind of given the climate we're in with the big COVID packages, the big recovery packages, I'm not sure there's a huge appetite for a big immigration package right now. So I think you're exactly right. Piecemeal might be how this immigration issue moves forward.
Yeah. And I would just add that on the 4th of February, no bill has actually been introduced. Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey has said that he is working with the White House and he intends to introduce the Biden Day 1 bill in the Senate. We understand that Representative Linda Sanchez of California is similarly working on a House bill, but we have not seen text and it hasn't been introduced yet. Even though it was announced on day 1 with a fact sheet from the White House of what presumably will be in it, the fact that, again, we've seen all of these executive orders, but we haven't yet seen legislative text, tells me that in terms of moving legislation as a priority, it's not all fully cooked yet.
This issue's hard, right? I mean, there's so many different perspectives, both within the Democratic caucus, and then when you bring in, if you're trying to get it bipartisan too, that brings in a whole different dynamic. And there's just so much on this White House and this Congress's plate to tackle right now that you're not going to be able to do it all at once. So yes, I agree that the fact that a day 1 bill has not even moved forward and it's day, I don't even know what now, I think shows you a little bit of the trickiness to this issue.
Absolutely. That's actually like a perfect segue to bring Casey into the conversation. So there's been, a lot of outpouring of support, particularly on the left, that this bill that we haven't seen the text of is the exact, remedy our system needs in terms of reforms. Yet Democrats only hold a 4-vote majority in the House, and they're evenly split with Republicans in the Senate. And the 60 votes needed to end the filibuster is unlikely to be eliminated. So given this, where do you see avenues for bipartisan cooperation on this bill? And if it's piecemeal, how do you see that playing out between the two parties and the different caucuses?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think, and I've said this before on this podcast, I think comprehensive is more difficult than a piecemeal approach. We've tried it in the past. We haven't been successful. At the end of the day, you have more reasons to vote against a bill than you have to actually vote for it. And it just has collapsed under its own weight and not worked. So I think that there's definitely a shift among Democrats as well to look at piecemeal and say, okay, is there a way to move the ball forward? While we wait for text on the Biden administration's bill, we have seen just today Durbin and Graham announcing that they have a bipartisan DREAM bill. And I think DREAM is the place that we are most likely to start. Whether you have the time to do that, as Laura so astutely mentioned, we have a lot on our plates in Congress this year. I think the question is, is there a forcing mechanism? Does the Supreme Court just decide that they're going to rule on DACA again, and is it at risk? And I think for the past several years, the Supreme Court has been a potential forcing mechanism for legislative action. And I think if that happens, you'll most certainly see a bipartisan dream bill move through. And I think that could actually break the dam on other legislation too. If we can do that in a piecemeal manner and get it through, and people can see that, there is support behind doing immigration reform and the world won't end at the passage of a bill, it might give members of Congress the political confidence to do other pieces of legislation. And I think, Laura brought up some great points in terms of what the COVID hook is on immigration. I think doctors and nurses is certainly an area that we're going to hear discussion about this year. There's a bipartisan bill that was introduced last Congress in the Senate that would give green cards to doctors and nurses who are working on the front lines right now. And frankly, we have a nursing shortage in this country anyway. So I think that there's some opportunity for bipartisanship there. You also saw a bill reforming our ag guest worker program move through the House last year with this bipartisan support, with 34 Republicans voting in favor of it. I think ag is, one of the industries most in need of reform from an immigration perspective. And I think Republicans and Democrats agree on that. So I think that that's another area prime for bipartisan cooperation, sooner rather than later, ideally. And beyond that, I think, it'll be interesting as the Biden bill is released to see what additional issues are in there that business interests will be interested in. From what I've seen so far, there's not a lot to address future flow. And I think what you're going to keep confronting with Republicans is we need to fix the system, especially if we're going to do any legalization, whether it be dreamers or ag workers or the undocumented population at large. We want to know that we're not going to come back 5-10 years from now and have to, address another huge undocumented population. So I think those future flow issues are going to be an ongoing topic of conversation.
I'll just pipe in there. I think, we didn't really talk about what is in the proposed bill. It does propose the broadest legalization I have ever seen in any piece of legislation. It would legalize essentially anybody who arrived in the country before, I think it's before January 1st, 2021. So potentially everyone who is undocumented in the United States could get legalized under this bill. There's a special legalization program for farm workers. It makes changes to, it does something called repealing the 3 and 10-year bars, which our immigration policy folks will know are things that bar people who have had undocumented status from obtaining visas they would otherwise be legally eligible for, like family sponsorship or employment sponsorship. It does not have a significant border security component. What it does say is that it wants to look at technology at the border, particularly at ports of entry, but also technology answers between the ports of entry, which is similar to bills that we have supported in the past as deals, if you will, for DACA or DREAM, but would not go so far as to build a wall or some of the more, I think, infrastructure heavy things that we saw under the Trump administration. The changes to the legal immigration system are not, I would say, fundamental to the structure of the system. They're more about playing with the numbers. So it would allow a recapture of visas that have been unused in the prior decades, which could be up to about 200,000 visas, and would allocate those back to the green card categories to help clear out existing backlogs. It would change the per country cap for family unification visas to 15% for each country rather than 7%. And eliminate the per country cap for employment-based visas, which also would help clear out existing backlogs of people who've been waiting in those categories. Supposedly, it would add more visas for the employment-based third category, which is unskilled workers, people who have less than a bachelor's degree. And supposedly it would also add visas to the diversity visa lottery category. So all of these things are I'd say, moderate increases to legal immigration, but what's missing is any fundamental change to how these categories work, who's selected, It wouldn't change the dynamic that 3/4 of or at least 2/3 of our visas are issued to family versus employment-based immigrants. So I think, as Casey said, if you're a business who's looking for help in securing future flow workforce, or if you're somebody who's looking at the border saying, it'd be great if we could find legal ways for these people to come rather than they're coming illegally, it doesn't seem like there's a lot in this bill that would get you all excited.
I mean, so given all this, and this is a question to everyone, given these executive orders and the draft section by section of this bill that we've seen, how important is it that Biden is using executive orders? Does it help his efforts on Capitol Hill, or do you think it'll make things difficult in the future to get additional reforms across the line, especially with Republicans?
So I think the use of executive orders are significant. I'm not sure they're, the tie I would put to Capitol Hill, though, is I think executive orders address what an administration views as a problem or an opportunity or something like that. The thing that we can see with executive orders is they only last as long as the life of an administration sometimes. At the top of the show, Theresa mentioned all these executive orders Biden was doing were essentially undoing the executive orders that President Trump did. If there's a subsequent administration, their day one activities might be undoing all the executive orders that President Biden did. So they're not durable solutions to policy problems. I kind of tend to think of executive orders as like a little bit of a Band-Aid, and sometimes you need stitches. And Congress is where the stitches come in because it's more permanent, it lasts. So I kind of think of them as hand in hand. An executive order might do something, and then Congress might have to come in and kind of like back up that executive order with legislation.
Yeah, I think in some ways, they're offering a political punchline on both sides of the aisle, right? We had several of them come from President Trump in the last administration. Now the Democrats are looking in the Biden administration to just reverse them. So it's, this back and forth ping pong where, the Republicans now might want to score some political points and criticize President Biden for these actions. But at the end of the day, it just shows how much we need Congress to step up and act and address some of these issues, because we've resorted to having to do executive action because we can't actually get together and get anything through Congress. And frankly, I look at, if there is another border crisis, we've had them several times in the past, Congress has never been able to step up and address these issues. And a lot of, the current back and forth with executive orders we're seeing is a result of asylum laws and other things like that. So it is indicative that when Congress can't step up and act to address these crises, the administration feels like they need to step in.
Yeah, I would just circle back to something Casey said earlier about DREAM also, is that, we have seen now, because as I already mentioned, one part of these executive actions have already been taken to court, that the courts end up being the adjudicator of these things when Congress isn't acting and the executive branch is acting instead. And so as much litigation as we talked about over the last 4 years against the Trump administration, creating our segment called The Gavel, where we try to track all this, I don't see that going away. We will have to continue the gavel because we are going to see court challenges to some of these executive orders that President Biden is issuing, not just on the DACA situation, but on the moratorium or the changes to enforcement policy or any number of executive actions that may come forward. And so I think that that's another reason why we have to figure out how we get Congress to seriously engage on these issues, to work beyond what tends to be sort of the partisan pointing fingers, and figure out what you can agree on to solve some of these problems, because it's not going to get any better unless they can really act and step up to the table.
Theresa, I think that's the perfect place to end this episode, and is a constant theme of what we talk about here on the podcast. So thank you all for joining me today. I hope you all stay warm as the snow starts to melt here in DC, and hope we see you next time on a future episode.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues that we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Iacono. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahada produces and edits our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.